When I received a message from my uncle, someone I've always loved, saying he's been in love with me since I was a baby, I couldn't believe my eyes. He explained that this was his true feeling and that he felt a spiritual calling to confess. The feeling of confusion and horror left me not knowing how to react. Things became even more complicated when I discovered that my close relatives already knew about this. What am I supposed to do in this situation? One morning, when my sister and I were driving our parents to the airport for their trip to Dubai, I received an unexpected message from my uncle, someone I always considered the closest and most beloved family member. At that moment, I was trying to focus on driving, but my phone kept buzzing. I glanced at the screen and saw my uncle's name, a name that always made me feel at ease whenever it appeared. However, this time felt different. He messaged, "Dear, I have something to share with you, and I feel a spiritual calling to tell you. I really need you to listen." I read the message several times, not understanding what he meant. My relationship with my uncle had always been very good. He was always the one who cared and shared interesting stories with me, especially after his trips where he'd use shrooms, which he enjoyed. He often told me about the strange spiritual experiences he had while on them, which made me feel a little uneasy, but I always listened and never judged. He was always someone I felt close to and never thought of in any other way but as my beloved uncle. However, I never expected this message from him. He continued, "You are the most beautiful creature I've ever met, and I've loved you since you were little, since you were just a child. I understand this may seem crazy, but my feelings are real. I want you to know that you're the only one who makes my life meaningful." I was left speechless. I felt completely shaken, like I had been hit with a sudden shock. The feeling of surprise and discomfort overwhelmed me, and I couldn't do anything except stare at the phone screen, unable to believe what I was reading. I tried to look around for support from my sister, but she was focused on driving. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to handle the strange and confusing feelings that flooded me. My uncle continued, "I told your aunt about my feelings before I told you. I understand if you don't understand or even feel uncomfortable, but I just want you to know about this." I couldn't believe I was reading these words. How could my uncle say such things? How could he look at me as someone he loved? I felt suffocated and nauseous. My mind couldn't process what was happening. It wasn't until after what felt like an eternity that I was able to push my emotions aside and turn to my sister. I showed her my phone and her face changed immediately upon seeing the screen. "No way, sis," she said, her voice full of shock. We both sat there in silence, not knowing what to do, just staring at each other, feeling completely lost. What was my uncle doing to me? Why was it me? After reading the message from my uncle, I felt an overwhelming weight in my chest. I didn't know what to do, how to respond to my sister, or even what to say to myself. The anxiety and confusion were unbearable. I stared at the phone screen, but everything around me seemed blurry. My sister, who was driving, sensed the change in the atmosphere, and eventually I decided to hand her my phone. We didn't say anything. We just exchanged looks, our eyes filled with fear and confusion. I knew this was a serious situation, but I didn't want to act hastily while my parents were in Dubai. I didn't want to ruin their trip or make them worry while they were away. So, I decided to keep this secret, at least until they returned. But the suffocating feeling wouldn't leave me. The words my uncle said kept echoing in my head, making it impossible to focus on anything else. That entire evening, I sat in silence, doing nothing but thinking about that message. Every time my phone rang, I felt a wave of panic. My uncle continued texting, but I couldn't bring myself to read any more of his messages. I just wanted to escape this situation, but everything seemed to get more complicated. I couldn't block him because I needed the evidence. I needed to prove to everyone that I wasn't imagining all of this. But deep down, I felt like I was losing control. Fatigue and anger began to take over me. How could my uncle do this? How could he look at me like that? I still couldn't understand it. I thought back to all the happy moments, all the times I spent with him, but now everything felt strange. My uncle had changed and I felt like I was being dragged into a pit with no way out. The next morning, I realized I couldn't keep hiding this anymore. I couldn't face it alone any longer. I gathered all my courage and sent my parents a message with screenshots of all the texts from my uncle. I felt confused, but I knew it was something that needed to be done. After all, I couldn't let this go on without anyone knowing. Once I sent the message, all I could do was sit and wait, unsure of how my parents would react. I didn't want to think about them being angry or disappointed, but I knew that the most important thing was to let them know the truth. And then, I could only hope that they would handle it in a way I couldn't manage on my own. After I sent the message to my parents, I felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders, but I couldn't stop worrying. I had no idea how they would react or if they would understand me. My mind was racing, everything felt chaotic, and I couldn't do anything but wait. My sister felt just as confused, but we didn't speak. We just sat in silence in the house, as if time had stopped. When my parents came back, I immediately saw a change in their faces. I could sense the worry in their eyes, even though they tried to remain calm. I couldn't look them in the eye, because I knew what I had sent them wasn't something easy to process. My mom stayed silent as she walked into the house, her eyes distant, while my dad seemed serious, like he was preparing for a difficult conversation. My dad told me to hand him my phone, and I did, not saying anything. He took the phone and left without saying a word, and I assumed he went to my uncle's place. At that point, I could only stand there, frozen, watching my dad's figure disappear down the hallway. My sister squeezed my hand and we sat on the couch, both silent, just waiting. About half an hour later, my phone rang again. It was a message from my mom. She told me that my aunt had called her, crying. My aunt said that when she first read the messages from my uncle, she thought it was fine, but once she realized how serious it was, she started feeling uncomfortable. My mom just replied briefly, saying that my aunt and uncle wouldn't be coming around anymore. I didn't understand why my aunt reacted this way, but deep down I felt a pang of hurt. My aunt was someone close to me. Why would she let things get this far? My dad returned after a while, and he didn't look happy at all. He sat down, silent for a moment, then looked at me and my sister. After a while he said seriously, "This has to stop right now. Your uncle will never have the chance to harm you again." Although I felt some relief hearing that, I still couldn't understand the situation fully. The conflicting feelings inside me didn't settle, and I still felt like I was trapped in a nightmare. My mom continued, her voice firm. "You will never see your aunt and uncle again. Don't worry, we'll handle everything." Even though I wanted to trust my mom's words, I still felt afraid of what would happen next. Would everything be resolved? Would my uncle face the consequences of his actions? These questions swirled in my mind, keeping me on edge. My sister and I sat there quietly, not knowing what to say next. My parents had done everything they could to protect us, but I couldn't shake the uncomfortable and unsettling feeling when I realized the truth. Still, I knew nothing could change the past, and all I had left was hope for a safer future for us. The following days, the atmosphere in the house became more tense than ever. Even though my parents had declared they would protect me and prevent me from seeing my uncle and aunt again, I couldn't shake the feeling of fear about what would happen next. Every time I looked at my phone, I felt a chill down my spine. My uncle kept texting me, but I didn't dare to read them. Those messages made me feel violated once more, as if I were being watched and controlled. My dad had promised he would do whatever it took to put an end to this, but I still couldn't fully understand everything that had happened. I wanted to ask him what he was going to do with my uncle, how he would confront him, but I didn't dare. I didn't even want to ask my mom, because I knew everything was already so serious. I could only sit still and wait for the next developments. One evening, when I was alone in my room, I received an unexpected phone call. It was from my aunt. Her voice was trembling, and I could feel the panic in every word. She said that my uncle was still talking about me to her, and she felt deeply ashamed and confused. She admitted that at first she hadn't thought it was a big deal, but now she realized her mistake in not intervening sooner. She also said that my uncle had left their house and she didn't know where he was. Her words made me feel even more shaken. I couldn't imagine my aunt reacting this way. How could an adult in the family just stand by and let this happen without acting? I felt as if I were falling into a world where no one could help me. After that phone call, I became even more anxious. It wasn't just my uncle's silence that unsettled me. Now my aunt wasn't even on my side. I wondered if my parents truly knew the whole truth. Even though I had sent them the messages, I still couldn't be sure they would do everything necessary to protect me. I felt increasingly isolated, confused, and unsure of who I could trust. The next day, my dad went to meet an old friend, and my mom decided to take my sister and me out for a walk to help ease our minds. Although I really wanted to have an open conversation with her, I still felt hesitant. My mom remained silent throughout the walk, only occasionally glancing at me, as if she, too, didn't know what to say. When I returned home, I noticed something had changed. My mom no longer talked about my uncle, and I didn't know if that was a sign of calm or if she was trying to protect me from further stress. However, I knew everything was not over. The questions still swirled in my mind. How would this all end? Could I ever feel at peace again? A week after everything happened, the atmosphere in the house was still heavy. But there seemed to be an unusual silence hanging over us. My mom no longer mentioned my uncle, and I didn't dare to ask about it either. However, in my mind, there were still many unanswered questions. Had everything been handled properly? Would my uncle face the consequences for his actions? I didn't know, and I didn't dare to ask anymore. That day, as I was sitting in my room, my mom walked in with a serious look on her face. She said, "You won't be seeing your uncle or aunt again. Your father and I will take care of everything. You don't need to worry." I looked into my mom's eyes, but I couldn't sense the certainty in her words. Still, I didn't want to make things more tense than they already were. I just hoped everything would end soon, and I could return to my normal life. However, despite what my mom said, I couldn't forget the strange messages my uncle had sent. I didn't know if he truly misunderstood or if he would continue acting like this in the future. The unease still lingered, preventing me from relaxing. My uncle had crossed a line I couldn't accept, and I couldn't understand why my aunt had let this happen. Their silence only made me more anxious. One day, while my sister and I were sitting in the living room, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find my dad standing outside, holding an envelope. He handed it to me and gave me a serious look. "You need to know about this. This is everything he wrote. Your uncle sent us his final words." I took the envelope and opened it. Inside was a long letter with scribbled and unclear words. What my uncle wrote only made me feel more confused. In the letter, my uncle admitted he had been wrong and felt deep regret. He wrote that while he was on shrooms, the feeling of loving me had taken over his mind, but after that, he realized it was an unforgivable mistake. However, he still insisted that the feeling was real and undeniable. He apologized for hurting me and hoped I would forgive him, though he knew that was impossible. I stared at the letter and felt a strange sensation. It wasn't real remorse, but rather an excuse for an unforgivable act. Although my uncle said he was wrong, I couldn't overlook what had happened. It was hard for me to comprehend that a family member could have such thoughts and actions. I felt deeply hurt, not just by the words, but by the irresponsibility and misunderstanding of what is right and wrong. My mom read the letter and just shook her head, then turned away. My dad also didn't say anything, but I could see the anger and disappointment in his eyes. Although we didn't speak any more words, I could feel a certainty in my heart that I would never be able to forgive my uncle for what he had done. My family was trying to protect me, but what I needed most right now was time to heal from the emotional scars my uncle had caused.